The Lodger by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 1. Lover and friend hast thou put far from me, and mine acquaintance into darkness. Psalm 88:18. Robert Bunting and Ellen his wife sat before their dully burning, carefully banked-up fire. The room, especially when it be known that it was part of a house standing in a grimy, if not exactly sordid, London thoroughfare, was exceptionally clean and well cared for. A casual stranger, more particularly one of a superior class to their own, on suddenly opening the door of that sitting-room, would have thought that Mr. and Mrs. Bunting presented a very pleasant, cozy picture of comfortable married life. Bunting, who was leaning back in a deep leather armchair, was clean-shaven and dapper, still in appearance what he had been for many years of his life, a self-respecting manservant. On his wife, now sitting up in an uncomfortable straight-backed chair, the marks of past servitude were less apparent, but they were there all the same, in her neat black stuff dress and in her scrupulously clean, plain collar and cuffs. Mrs. Bunting, as a single woman, had been what is known as a useful maid, but peculiarly true of average English life is the time-worn English proverb as to appearances being deceitful. Mr. and Mrs. Bunting were sitting in a very nice room, and in their time, how long ago it now seemed, both husband and wife had been proud of their carefully chosen belongings. Everything in the room was strong and substantial, and each article of furniture had been bought at a well-conducted auction held in a private house. Thus, the red damask curtains which now shut out the fog-laden, drizzling atmosphere of the Marylebone Road had cost a mere song, and yet they might have been warranted to last another 30 years. A great bargain also had been the excellent Axminster carpet which covered the floor, as again the armchair in which Bunting now sat forward, staring into the dull, small fire. In fact, that armchair had been an extravagance of Mrs. Bunting. She had wanted her husband to be comfortable after the day's work was done, and she had paid 37 shillings for the chair. Only yesterday Bunting had tried to find a purchaser for it, but the man who had come to look at it, guessing their cruel necessities, had only offered them 12 shillings and sixpence for it. So for the present they were keeping their armchair. But man and woman want something more than mere material comfort, much as that is valued by the Buntings of this world. So, on the walls of the sitting-room, hung neatly framed, if now rather faded photographs of Mr. and Mrs. Bunting's various former employers, and of the pretty country houses in which they had separately lived during the long years they had spent in a not unhappy servitude. But appearances were not only deceitful, they were more than usually deceitful with regard to these unfortunate people. In spite of their good furniture, that substantial outward sign of respectability which is the last thing which wise folk who fall into trouble try to dispose of, they were almost at the end of their tether. Already they had learnt to go hungry, and they were beginning to learn to go cold. Tobacco, the last thing the sober man forgoes among his comforts, had been given up some time ago by Bunting, and even Mrs. Bunting, prim, prudent, careful woman as she was in her way, had realized what this must mean to him. So well, indeed, had she understood that some days back she had crept out and bought him a packet of Virginia. Bunting had been touched as he had not been for years by any woman's thought and love for him. Painful tears had forced themselves into his eyes, and husband and wife had both felt in their odd, unemotional way moved to the heart. Fortunately, he never guessed, how could he have guessed with his slow, normal, rather dull mind, that his poor Ellen had since more than once bitterly regretted that 4-pence halfpenny, for they were now very near the soundless depths which divide those who dwell on the safe table-land of security, those, that is, who are sure of making a respectable if not a happy living, and the submerged multitude who, through some lack in themselves, or owing to the conditions under which our strange civilization has become organized, struggle rudderless till they die in workhouse, hospital, or prison. Had the Buntings been in a class lower than their own, had they belonged to the great company of human beings technically known to so many of us as the poor, there would have been friendly neighbors ready to help them, and the same would have been the case had they belonged to the class of smug, well-meaning, if unimaginative folk whom they had spent so much of their lives in serving. There was only one person in the world who might possibly be brought to help them. That was an aunt of Bunting's first wife. With this woman, the widow of a man who had been well-to-do, lived Daisy, Bunting's only child by his first wife, and during the last long 2 days he had been trying to make up his mind to write to the old lady, and that though he suspected that she would almost certainly retort with a cruel, sharp rebuff. As to their few acquaintances, former fellow servants and so on, they had gradually fallen out of touch with them. There was but one friend who often came to see them in their deep trouble. This was a young fellow named Chandler, under whose grandfather Bunting had been footman years and years ago. Joe Chandler had never gone into service. He was attached to the police. In fact, not to put too fine a point upon it, young Chandler was a detective. When they had first taken the house which had brought them, so they both thought, such bad luck, Bunting had encouraged the young chap to come often, for his tales were well worth listening to, quite exciting at times. But now poor Bunting didn't want to hear that sort of stories of people being cleverly nabbed or stupidly allowed to escape the fate they always, from Chandler's point of view, richly deserved. But Joe still came very faithfully once or twice a week, so timing his calls that neither host nor hostess need press food upon him. Nay, more, he had done that which showed him to have a good and feeling heart. He had offered his father's old acquaintance a loan, and Bunting at last had taken 30 shillings. Very little of that money now remained. Bunting still could jingle a few coppers in his pocket, and Mrs. Bunting had 2 shillings 9 pence. That and the rent they would have to pay in 5 weeks was all they had left. Everything of the light, portable sort that would fetch money had been sold. Mrs. Bunting had a fierce horror of the pawn shop. She had never put her feet in such a place, and she declared she never would. She would rather starve first. But she had said nothing when there had occurred the gradual disappearance of various little possessions she knew that Bunting valued, notably of the old-fashioned gold watch chain which had been given to him after the death of his first master, a master he had nursed faithfully and kindly through a long and terrible illness. There had also vanished a twisted gold tie-pin and a large mourning ring, both gifts of former employers. When people are living near that deep pit which divides the secure from the insecure, when they see themselves creeping closer and closer to its dread edge, they are apt, however loquacious by nature, to fall into long silences. Bunting had always been a talker, but now he talked no more. Neither did Mrs. Bunting, but then she had always been a silent woman, and that was perhaps one reason why Bunting had felt drawn to her from the very first moment he had seen her. It had fallen out in this way. A lady had just engaged him as butler, and he had been shown, by the man whose place he was to take, into the dining-room. There, to use his own expression, he had discovered Ellen Green, carefully pouring out the glass of port wine which her then mistress always drank at 11:30 every morning. And as he, the new butler, had seen her engaged in this task, as he had watched her carefully stopper the decanter and put it back into the old wine-cooler, he had said to himself, "That is the woman for me." But now her stillness, her dumbness had got on the unfortunate man's nerves. He no longer felt like going into the various little shops close by, patronized by him in more prosperous days, and Mrs. Bunting also went afield to make the slender purchases which still had to be made every day or two if they were to be saved from actually starving to death. Suddenly, across the stillness of the dark November evening, there came the muffled sounds of hurrying feet and of loud, shrill shouting outside, boys crying the late afternoon editions of the evening papers. Bunting turned uneasily in his chair. The giving up of a daily paper had been, after his tobacco, his bitterest deprivation, and the paper was an older habit than the tobacco, for servants are great readers of newspapers. As the shouts came through the closed windows and the thick damask curtains, Bunting felt a sudden sense of mind-hunger fall upon him. It was a shame, a damned shame, that he shouldn't know what was happening in the world outside. Only criminals are kept from hearing news of what is going on beyond their prison walls, and those shouts, those hoarse, sharp cries must portend that something really exciting had happened, something warranted to make a man forget for the moment his own intimate, gnawing troubles. He got up, and going towards the nearest window, strained his ears to listen. There fell on them, emerging now and again from the confused babble of hoarse shouts, the one clear word, murder. Slowly Bunting's brain pieced the loud, indistinct cries into some sort of connected order. Yes, that was it. Horrible murder. Murder at St. Pancras. Bunting remembered vaguely another murder which had been committed near St. Pancras, that of an old lady by her servant-maid. It had happened a great many years ago, but was still vividly remembered as of special and natural interest among the class to which he had belonged. The newsboys, for there were more than one of them, a rather unusual thing on the Marylebone Road, were coming nearer and nearer. Now they had adopted another cry, but he could not quite catch what they were crying. They were still shouting hoarsely, excitedly, but he could only hear a word or two now and then. Suddenly, the Avenger at his work again, broke on his ear. During the last fortnight, 4 very curious and brutal murders had been committed in London and within a comparatively small area. The first had aroused no special interest. Even the second had only been awarded, and the paper Bunting was still then taking in, quite a small paragraph. Then had come the third, and with that a wave of keen excitement, for pinned to the dress of the victim, a drunken woman, had been found a 3-cornered piece of paper on which was written in red ink and in printed characters the words, "The Avenger." It was then realized, not only by those whose business it is to investigate such terrible happenings, but also by the vast world of men and women who take an intelligent interest in such sinister mysteries, that the same miscreant had committed all 3 crimes, and before that extraordinary fact had had time to soak well into the public mind, there took place yet another murder, and again the murderer had been to special pains to make it clear that some obscure and terrible lust for vengeance possessed him. Now everyone was talking of the Avenger and his crimes. Even the man who left their ha'porth of milk at the door each morning had spoken to Bunting about them that very day. Bunting came back to the fire and looked down at his wife with mild excitement. Then, seeing her pale, apathetic face, her look of weary, mournful absorption, a wave of irritation swept through him. He felt he could have shaken her. Ellen had hardly taken the trouble to listen when he, Bunting, had come back to bed that morning and told her what the milkman had said. In fact, she had been quite nasty about it, intimating that she didn't like hearing about such horrid things. It was a curious fact that though Mrs. Bunting enjoyed tales of pathos and sentiment, and would listen with frigid amusement to the details of a breach of promise action, she shrank from stories of immorality or physical violence. In the old happy days, when they could afford to buy a paper, aye, and more than one paper daily, Bunting had often had to choke down his interest in some exciting case or mystery which was affording him pleasant mental relaxation, because any allusion to it sharply angered Ellen. But now he was at once too dull and too miserable to care how she felt. Walking away from the window, he took a slow, uncertain step towards the door. When there he turned half round, and there came over his close-shaven round face the rather sly, pleading look with which a child about to do something naughty glances at its parent. But Mrs. Bunting remained quite still. Her thin, narrow shoulders just showed above the back of the chair on which she was sitting, bolt upright, staring before her as if into vacancy. Bunting turned round, opened the door, and quickly he went out into the dark hall. They had given up lighting the gas there some time ago, and opened the front door. Walking down the small flagged path outside, he flung open the iron gate which gave on to the damp pavement. But there he hesitated. The coppers in his pocket seemed to have shrunk in number, and he remembered ruefully how far Ellen could make even 4 pennies go. Then a boy ran up to him with a sheaf of evening papers, and Bunting, being sorely tempted, fell. "Give me a Sun," he said roughly, "Sun or Echo." But the boy, scarcely stopping to take breath, shook his head. "Only penny papers left," he gasped. "What do you have, sir?" With an eagerness which was mingled with shame, Bunting drew a penny out of his pocket and took a paper. It was the Evening Standard, from the boy's hand. Then very slowly he shut the gate and walked back through the raw, cold air up the flagged path, shivering yet full of eager, joyful anticipation. Thanks to that penny he had just spent so recklessly, he would pass a happy hour, taken for once out of his anxious, despondent, miserable self. It irritated him shrewdly to know that these moments of respite from cark and care would not be shared with his poor wife, with careworn, troubled Ellen. A hot wave of unease, almost of remorse, swept over Bunting. Ellen would never have spent that penny on herself. He knew that well enough. And if it hadn't been so cold, so foggy, so drizzly, he would have gone out again through the gate and stood under the street lamp to take his pleasure. He dreaded with a nervous dread the glance of Ellen's cold, reproving, light blue eyes. That glance would tell him that he had had no business to waste a penny on a paper, and that well he knew it. Suddenly the door in front of him opened, and he heard a familiar voice saying crossly yet anxiously, "What on earth are you doing out there, Bunting? Come in, do. You'll catch your death of cold. I don't want to have you ill on my hands as well as everything else." Mrs. Bunting rarely uttered so many words at once nowadays. He walked in through the front door of his cheerless house. "I went out to get a paper," he said sullenly. After all, he was master. He had as much right to spend the money as she had. For the matter of that, the money on which they were now both living had been lent, nay, pressed on him, not on Ellen, by that decent young chap, Joe Chandler. And he, Bunting, had done all he could. He had pawned everything he could pawn, while Ellen, so he resentfully noticed, still wore her wedding ring. He stepped past her heavily, and though she said nothing, he knew she grudged him his coming joy. Then, full of rage with her and contempt for himself, and giving himself the luxury of a very mild oath, Ellen had very early made it clear she would have no swearing in her presence, he lit the hall gas full flare. "How can we hope to get lodgers if they can't even see the card?" he shouted angrily. And there was truth in what he said, for now that he had lit the gas, the oblong card, though not the word apartments printed on it, could be plainly seen outlined against the old-fashioned fanlight above the front door. Bunting went into the sitting-room, silently followed by his wife, and then, sitting down in his nice armchair, he poked the little banked-up fire. It was the first time Bunting had poked the fire for many a long day, and this exertion of marital authority made him feel better. A man has to assert himself sometimes, and he, Bunting, had not asserted himself enough lately. A little color came into Mrs. Bunting's pale face. She was not used to be flouted in this way, for Bunting, when not thoroughly upset, was the mildest of men. She began moving about the room, flicking off an imperceptible touch of dust here, straightening a piece of furniture there. But her hands trembled. They trembled with excitement, with self-pity, with anger. A penny? It was dreadful, dreadful to have to worry about a penny. But they had come to the point when one has to worry about pennies. Strange that her husband didn't realize that. Bunting looked round once or twice. He would have liked to ask Ellen to leave off fidgeting, but he was fond of peace and perhaps by now a little bit ashamed of himself, so he refrained from remark, and she soon gave over what irritated him of her own accord. But Mrs. Bunting did not come and sit down as her husband would have liked her to do. The sight of him, absorbed in his paper as he was, irritated her and made her long to get away from him. Opening the door which separated the sitting-room from the bedroom behind, and, shutting out the aggravating vision of Bunting sitting comfortably by the now brightly burning fire, with the Evening Standard spread out before him, she sat down in the cold darkness and pressed her hands against her temples. Never, never had she felt so hopeless, so broken as now. Where was the good of having been an upright, conscientious, self-respecting woman all her life long, if it only led to this utter, degrading poverty and wretchedness? She and Bunting were just past the age which gentlefolk think proper in a married couple seeking to enter service together, unless, that is, the wife happens to be a professed cook. A cook and a butler can always get a nice situation, but Mrs. Bunting was no cook. She could do all right the simple things any lodger she might get would require, but that was all. Lodgers. How foolish she had been to think of taking lodgers, for it had been her doing. Bunting had been like butter in her hands. Yet they had begun well, with a lodging-house in a seaside place. There they had prospered, not as they had hoped to do, but still pretty well, and then had come an epidemic of scarlet fever, and that had meant ruin for them, and for dozens, nay hundreds of other luckless people. Then had followed a business experiment which had proved even more disastrous, and which had left them in debt to an extent they could never hope to repay, to a good-natured former employer. After that, instead of going back to service, as they might have done, perhaps either together or separately, they had made up their minds to make one last effort, and they had taken over, with the trifle of money that remained to them, the lease of this house in the Marylebone Road. In former days, when they had each been leading the sheltered, impersonal, and above all financially easy existence which is the compensation life offers to those men and women who deliberately take upon themselves the yoke of domestic service, they had both lived in houses overlooking Regent's Park. It had seemed a wise plan to settle in the same neighborhood, the more so that Bunting, who had a good appearance, had retained the kind of connection which enables a man to get a job now and again as waiter at private parties. But life moves quickly, jaggedly for people like the Buntings. Two of his former masters had moved to another part of London, and a caterer in Baker Street whom he had known went bankrupt. And now? Well, Just now Bunting could not have taken a job had one been offered him, for he had pawned his dress clothes. He had not asked his wife's permission to do this, as so good a husband ought to have done. He had just gone out and done it, and she had not had the heart to say anything. Nay, it was with part of the money that he had handed her silently the evening he did it that she had bought that last packet of tobacco. And then, as Mrs. Bunting sat there thinking these painful thoughts, there suddenly came to the front door the sound of a loud, tremulous, uncertain double knock. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Lodger by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 2. Mrs. Bunting jumped nervously to her feet. She stood for a moment listening in the darkness. A darkness made the blacker by the line of light under the door behind which sat Bunting reading his paper. And then it came again, that loud, tremulous, uncertain double knock. Not a knock, so the listener told herself, that boded any good. Would-be lodgers gave sharp, quick, bold, confident raps. No, this must be some kind of beggar. The queerest people came at all hours, and asked, whining or threatening, for money. Mrs. Bunting had had some sinister experiences with men and women, especially women, drawn from that nameless, mysterious class made up of the human flotsam and jetsam which drifts about every great city. But since she had taken to leaving the gas in the passage unlit at night, she had been very little troubled with that kind of visitors, those human bats which are attracted by any kind of light, but leave alone those who live in darkness. She opened the door of the sitting-room. It was Bunting's place to go to the front door, but she knew far better than he did how to deal with difficult or obtrusive callers. Still, somehow, she would have liked him to go tonight. But Bunting sat on, absorbed in his newspaper. All he did at the sound of the bedroom door opening was to look up and say, "Didn't you hear a knock?" Without answering his question, she went out into the hall. Slowly she opened the front door. On the top of the 3 steps which led up to the door, there stood the long, lanky figure of a man, clad in an Inverness cape and an old-fashioned top hat. He waited for a few seconds, blinking at her, perhaps dazzled by the light of the gas in the passage. Mrs. Bunting's trained perception told her at once that this man, odd as he looked, was a gentleman, belonging by birth to the class with whom her former employment had brought her in contact. "Is it not a fact that you let lodgings?" he asked, and there was something shrill, unbalanced, hesitating in his voice. "Yes, sir," she said uncertainly. It was a long, long time since anyone had come after their lodgings, anyone, that is, that they could think of taking into their respectable house. Instinctively she stepped a little to one side, and the stranger walked past her, and so into the hall. And then, for the first time, Mrs. Bunting noticed that he held a narrow bag in his left hand. It was quite a new bag, made of strong brown leather. "I am looking for some quiet rooms," he said. Then he repeated the words, "quiet rooms," in a dreamy, absent way, and as he uttered them he looked nervously round him. Then his sallow face brightened, for the hall had been carefully furnished and was very clean. There was a neat hat and umbrella stand, and the stranger's weary feet fell soft on a good, serviceable, dark red drugget, which matched in color the flock paper on the walls. A very superior lodging-house, this, and evidently a superior lodging-house keeper. "You'd find my rooms quite quiet, sir," she said gently, "and just now I have 4 to let. The house is empty save for my husband and me, sir." Mrs. Bunting spoke in a civil, passionless voice. It seemed too good to be true, the sudden coming of a possible lodger, and of a lodger who spoke in the pleasant, courteous way and voice which recalled to the poor woman her happy far-off days of youth and of security. "That sounds very suitable," he said. "4 rooms? Well, perhaps I ought only to take 2 rooms, but still, I should like to see all 4 before I make my choice." How fortunate, how very fortunate it was that Bunting had lit the gas. But for that circumstance this gentleman would have passed them by. She turned towards the staircase, quite forgetting in her agitation that the front door was still open, and it was a stranger whom she already in her mind described as the lodger, who turned and rather quickly walked down the passage and shut it. "Oh, thank you, sir," she exclaimed. "I'm sorry you should have had the trouble." For a moment their eyes met. "It's not safe to leave a front door open in London," he said, rather sharply. "I hope you do not often do that. It would be so easy for anyone to slip in." Mrs. Bunting felt rather upset. The stranger had still spoken courteously, but he was evidently very much put out. "I assure you, sir, I never leave my front door open," she answered hastily. "You needn't be at all afraid of that." And then, through the closed door of the sitting room, came the sound of Bunting coughing. It was just a little hard cough, but Mrs. Bunting's future lodger started violently. "Who's that?" he said, putting out a hand and clutching her arm. "Whatever was that?" "Only my husband, sir. He went out to buy paper a few minutes ago, and the cold just caught him, I suppose." "Your husband?" He looked at her intently, suspiciously. What may I ask is your husband's occupation?" Mrs. Bunting drew herself up. The question as to Bunting's occupation was no one's business but theirs. Still, it wouldn't do for her to show offense. "He goes out waiting," she said stiffly. "He was a gentleman's servant, sir. He could, of course, valet you should you require him to do so." And then she turned and led the way up the steep, narrow staircase. At the top of the first flight of stairs was what Mrs. Bunting, to herself, called the drawing-room floor. It consisted of a sitting-room in front and a bedroom behind. She opened the door of the sitting-room and quickly lit the chandelier. This front room was pleasant enough, though perhaps a little over-encumbered with furniture. Covering the floor was a green carpet simulating moss. 4 chairs were placed round the table, which occupied the exact middle of the apartment, and in the corner, opposite the door giving on to the landing, was a roomy, old-fashioned chiffonier. On the dark green walls hung a series of 8 engravings, portraits of early Victorian belles, clad in lace and Tarleton ball dresses, clipped from an old book of beauty. Mrs. Bunting was very fond of these pictures. She thought they gave the drawing-room a note of elegance and refinement. As she hurriedly turned up the gas, she was glad indeed, that she had summed up sufficient energy 2 days ago to give the room a thorough turn-out. It had remained for a long time in the state in which it had been left by its last dishonest, dirty occupants when they had been scared into going away by Bunting's rough threats of the police. But now it was in apple-pie order, with one paramount exception, of which Mrs. Bunting was painfully aware. There were no white curtains to the windows, but that omission could soon be remedied if this gentleman really took the lodgings. But what was this? The stranger was looking round him rather dubiously. "This is rather too grand for me," he said at last. "I should like to see your other rooms, Mrs. Bunting," she said softly. "Bunting, sir." And as she spoke, the dark, heavy load of care again came down and settled on her sad, burdened heart. Perhaps she had been mistaken after all. Or rather, she had not been mistaken in one sense, but perhaps this gentleman was a poor gentleman, too poor, that is, to afford the rent of more than one room, say 8 or 10 shillings a week. 8 or 10 shillings a week would be very little use to her in Bunting, though better than nothing at all. "Will you just look at the bedroom, sir?" "No," he said, "no. I think I should like to see what you have farther up the house, Mrs." And then, as if making a prodigious mental effort, he brought out her name, Bunting, with a kind of gasp. The 2 top rooms were, of course, immediately above the drawing-room floor, but they looked poor and mean, owing to the fact that they were bare of any kind of ornament. Very little trouble had been taken over their arrangement. In fact, they had been left in much the same condition as that in which the Buntings had found them. For the matter of that, it is difficult to make a nice, genteel sitting-room out of an apartment of which the principal features are a sink and a big gas stove. The gas stove, of an obsolete pattern, was fed by a tiresome, shilling-in-the-slot arrangement. It had been the property of the people from whom the Buntings had taken over the lease of the house, who, knowing it to be of no monetary value, had thrown it in among the humble fittings they had left behind. What furniture there was in the room was substantial and clean, as everything belonging to Mrs. Bunting was bound to be, but it was a bare, uncomfortable-looking place, and the landlady now felt sorry that she had done nothing to make it appear more attractive. To her surprise, however, her companion's dark, sensitive, hatchet-shaped face became irradiated with satisfaction. "Capital, capital!" he exclaimed, for the first time putting down the bag he held at his feet, and rubbing his long, thin hands together with a quick, nervous movement. "This is just what I have been looking for." He walked with long, eager strides towards the gas stove. "First rate, quite first rate. Exactly what I wanted to find. You must understand, Mrs. Bunting, that I am a man of science. I make, that is, all sorts of experiments, and I often require the presence of great heat." He shot out a hand, which she noticed shook a little, towards the stove. This too will be useful, exceedingly useful to me, and he touched the edge of the stone sink with a lingering, caressing touch. He threw his head back and passed his hand over his high, bare forehead. Then, moving towards a chair, he sat down, wearily. "I'm tired," he muttered in a low voice. "Tired, tired. I've been walking about all day, Mrs. Bunting, and I could find nothing to sit down upon. They do not put benches for tired men in the London streets. They do so on the Continent. In some ways they are far more humane on the Continent than they are in England, Mrs. Bunting." "Indeed, sir," she said civilly, and then, after a nervous glance, she asked the question of which the answer would mean so much to her. "Then you mean to take my rooms, sir?" "This room, certainly," he said, looking round. "This room is exactly what I have been looking for and longing for the last few days." And then hastily he added, "I mean, this kind of place is what I have always wanted to possess, Mrs. Bunting. You would be surprised if you knew how difficult it is to get anything of the sort. But now my weary search has ended, and that is a relief, a very, very great relief to me." He stood up and looked round him with a dreamy, abstracted air. And then, "Where's my bag?" he asked suddenly, and there came a note of sharp, angry fear in his voice. He glared at the quiet woman standing before him, and for a moment Mrs. Bunting felt a tremor of fright shoot through her. It seemed a pity that Bunting was so far away, right down the house. But Mrs. Bunting was aware that eccentricity has always been a perquisite, as it were, a special luxury of the well-born and of the well-educated. Scholars, as she well knew, are never quite like other people, and her new lodger was undoubtedly a scholar. "Surely I had a bag when I came in," he said in a scared, troubled voice. "Here it is, sir," she said soothingly, and stooping, picked it up and handed it to him. And as she did so, she noticed that the bag was not at all heavy. It was evidently by no means full. He took it eagerly from her. "I beg your pardon," he muttered, "but there is something in that bag which is very precious to me, something I procured with infinite difficulty, and which I could never get again without running into great danger, Mrs. Bunting. That must be the excuse for my late agitation." "About terms, sir," she said a little timidly, returning to the subject which meant so much, so very much to her. "About terms," he echoed. And then there came a pause. "My name is Sleuth," he said suddenly. "Sleuth. Think of a hound, Mrs. Bunting, and you'll never forget my name. I can provide you with a reference." He gave her what she described to herself as a funny sideways look. "But I should prefer you to dispense with that if you don't mind. I am quite willing to pay you, well, shall we say a month in advance?" A spot of red shot into Mrs. Bunting's cheeks. She felt sick with relief, nay, with a joy which was almost pain. She had not known till that moment how hungry she was, how eager for a good meal. "That would be all right, sir," she murmured. "And what are you going to charge me?" There had come a kindly, almost a friendly note into his voice. "With attendance, mind. I shall expect you to give me attendance, and I need hardly ask if you can cook, Mrs. Bunting." "Oh, yes, sir," she said. "I'm a plain cook. What would you say to 25 shillings a week, sir?" She looked at him deprecatingly, and as he did not answer, she went on falteringly, "You see, sir, it may seem a good deal, but you would have the best of attendance and careful cooking, and my husband, sir, he would be pleased to valet you." "I shouldn't want anything of that sort done for me," said Mr. Sleuth hastily. "I prefer looking after my own clothes. I am used to waiting on myself. But, Mrs. Bunting, I have a great dislike to sharing lodgings," she interrupted eagerly. "I could let you have the use of the 2 floors for the same price, that is, until we get another lodger. I shouldn't like you to sleep in the back room up here, sir. It's such a poor little room. You could do as you say, sir. Do your work and your experiments up here, and then have your meals in the drawing-room." "Yes," he said hesitatingly, "that sounds a good plan. And if I offered you £2 or 2 guineas, might I then rely on your not taking another lodger?" "Yes," she said quietly. "I'd be very glad only to have you to wait on, sir." "I suppose you have a key to the door of this room, Mrs. Bunting. I don't like to be disturbed while I'm working." He waited a moment, and then said again, rather urgently, "I suppose you have a key to this door, Mrs. Bunting?" "Oh, yes, sir, there's a key, a very nice little key. The people who lived here before had a new kind of lock put on to the door." She went over, and throwing the door open, showed him that a round disc had been fitted above the old keyhole. He nodded his head, and then, after standing silent a little, as if absorbed in thought, 42 shillings a week. Yes, that will suit me perfectly, and I'll begin now by paying my first month's rent in advance. Now, 4 times 42 shillings is—" He jerked his head back and stared at his new landlady. For the first time he smiled, a queer, wry smile. "Why, just £8, 8 shillings, Mrs. Bunting." He thrust his hand through into an inner pocket of his long cape-like coat and took out a handful of sovereigns. Then he began putting these down in a row on the bare wooden table which stood in the center of the room. "Here is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, £10. You'd better keep the odd change, Mrs. Bunting, for I shall want you to do some shopping for me tomorrow morning. I met with a misfortune today." But the new lodger did not speak as if his misfortune, whatever it was, weighed on his spirits. "Indeed, sir, I'm sorry to hear that." Mrs. Bunting's heart was going thump, thump, thump. She felt extraordinarily moved, dizzy with relief and joy. "Yes, a very great misfortune. I lost my luggage, the few things I managed to bring away with me." His voice dropped suddenly. "I shouldn't have said that," he muttered. "I was a fool to say that." Then more loudly, "Someone said to me, 'You can't go into a lodging-house without any luggage. They wouldn't take you in.' But you have taken me in, Mrs. Bunting, and I'm grateful for the kind way you have met me." He looked at her feelingly, appealingly, and Mrs. Bunting was touched. She was beginning to feel very kindly towards her new lodger. "I hope I know a gentleman when I see one," she said, with a break in her staid voice. "I shall have to see about getting some clothes tomorrow, Mrs. Bunting." Again he looked at her appealingly. "I expect you'd like to wash your hands now, sir. And would you tell me what you'd like for supper? We haven't much in the house." "Oh, anything'll do," he said hastily. "I don't want you to go out for me. It's a cold, foggy, wet night, Mrs. Bunting. If you have a little bread and butter and a cup of milk, I shall be quite satisfied." "I have a nice sausage," she said hesitatingly. It was a very nice sausage, and she had bought it that same morning for Bunting's supper. As to herself, she had been going to content herself with a little bread and cheese. But now, wonderful, almost intoxicating thought, she could send Bunting out to get anything they both liked. The 10 sovereigns lay in her hand, full of comfort and good cheer. "A sausage? No, I fear that will hardly do. I never touch flesh meat," he said. "It is a long, long time since I tasted a sausage, Mrs. Bunting." "Is it indeed, sir?" She hesitated a moment, then asked stiffly, "And will you be requiring any beer or wine, sir?" A strange, wild look of lowering wrath suddenly filled Mr. Sleuth's pale face. "Certainly not. I thought I had made that quite clear, Mrs. Bunting. I had hoped to hear that you were an abstainer." "So I am, sir, lifelong, and so's Bunting been since we married." She might have said, had she been a woman given to make such confidences, that she had made Bunting abstain very quickly in their acquaintance. That he had given in about that had been the thing that first made her believe that he was sincere in all the nonsense that he talked to her in those far-away days of his courting. Glad she was now that he had taken the pledge as a younger man. But for that, nothing would have kept him from the drink during the bad times they had gone through. And then, going downstairs, she showed Mr. Sleuth the nice bedroom which opened out of the drawing-room. It was a replica of Mrs. Bunting's own room just underneath, excepting that everything up here had cost just a little more, and was therefore rather better in quality. The new lodger looked round him with such a strange expression of content and peace stealing over his worn face. "A haven of rest," he muttered, and then, "He bringeth them to their desired haven." Beautiful words, Mrs. Bunting. "Yes, sir." Mrs. Bunting felt a little startled. It was the first time anyone had quoted the Bible to her for many a long day, but it seemed to set the seal, as it were, on Mr. Sleuth's respectability. The Lodger, by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 3. But what was a little snub compared with the intense relief and joy of going down and telling Bunting of the great piece of good fortune which had fallen their way? Staid Mrs. Bunting seemed to make but one leap down the steep stairs. In the hall, however, she pulled herself together and tried to still her agitation. She had always disliked and despised any show of emotion. She called such betrayal of feeling making a fuss. Opening the door of their sitting-room, she stood for a moment looking at her husband's bent back, and she realized, with a pang of pain, how the last few weeks had aged him. Bunting suddenly looked round, and seeing his wife, stood up. He put the paper he had been holding down onto the table. "Well," he said. "Well, who was it then?" He felt rather ashamed of himself. It was he who ought to have answered the door and done all that parleying of which he had heard murmurs. And then in a moment his wife's hand shot out, and the 10 sovereigns fell in a little clinking heap on the table. "Look there," she whispered with an excited, tearful quiver in her voice. "Look there, Bunting." And Bunting did look there, but with a troubled, frowning gaze. He was not quick-witted, but at once he jumped to the conclusion that his wife had just had in a furniture dealer, and that this £10 represented all their nice furniture upstairs. If that were so, then it was the beginning of the end. That furniture in the first-floor front had cost, Ellen had reminded him of the fact bitterly only yesterday, £17 9 shillings, and every single item had been a bargain. It was too bad that she had only got £10 for it. Yet he hadn't the heart to reproach her. He did not speak as he looked across at her, and meeting that troubled, rebuking glance, she guessed what it was that he thought had happened. "We've a new lodger," she cried, and Bunting? He's quite the gentleman. He actually offered to pay 4 weeks in advance at 2 guineas a week." "No, never." Bunting moved quickly round the table, and together they stood there, fascinated by the little heap of gold. "But there's 10 sovereigns here," he said suddenly. "Yes, the gentleman said I'd have to buy some things for him tomorrow. And oh, Bunting, he's so well spoken. I really felt that. And then Mrs. Bunting, taking a step or two sideways, sat down and throwing her little black apron over her face, burst into gasping sobs. Bunting patted her back timidly. "Ellen," he said, much moved by her agitation. "Ellen, don't take on so, my dear." "I won't," she sobbed. I won't. I'm a fool. I know I am. But oh, I didn't think we was ever going to have any luck again." And then she told him, or rather tried to tell him, what the lodger was like. Mrs. Bunting was no hand at talking, but one thing she did impress on her husband's mind, namely that Mr. Sleuth was eccentric, as so many clever people are eccentric, that is, in a harmless way, and that he must be humored. "He says he doesn't want to be waited on much," she said at last, wiping her eyes. "But I can see he will want a good bit of looking after, all the same, poor gentleman." And just as the words left her mouth there came the unfamiliar sound of a loud ring. It was that of the drawing-room bell being pulled again and again. Bunting looked at his wife eagerly. "I think I'd better go up, Ellen?" he said. He felt quite anxious to see their new lodger. For the matter of that, it would be a relief to be doing something again. "Yes," she answered. "You go up. Don't keep him waiting. I wonder what it is he wants. I said I'd let him know when his supper was ready." A moment later Bunting came down again. There was an odd smile on his face. "Whatever do you think he wanted?" he whispered mysteriously, and as she said nothing, he went on. "He's asking for the loan of a Bible." "Well, I don't see anything so out of the way in that," she said hastily, "especially if you don't feel well. I'll take it up to him." And then going to a small table which stood between the 2 windows, Mrs. Bunting took off it a large Bible, which had been given to her as a wedding present by a married lady with whose mother she had lived for several years. "He said it would do quite well when you take up his supper," said Bunting. And then, "Ellen, he's a queer-looking cove, not like any gentleman I ever had to do with." "He is a gentleman," said Mrs. Bunting rather fiercely. "Oh, yes, that's all right." But still he looked at her doubtfully. "I asked him if he'd like me to just put away his clothes. But, Ellen, he said he hadn't got any clothes." "No more he hasn't." She spoke quickly, defensively. "He had the misfortune to lose his luggage. He's one dishonest folk could take advantage of." "Yes, one can see that with half an eye," Bunting agreed. And then there was silence for a few moments while Mrs. Bunting put down on a little bit of paper the things she wanted her husband to go out and buy for her. She handed him the list together with a sovereign. "Be as quick as you can," she said, "for I feel a bit hungry. I'll be going down now to see about Mr. Sleuth's supper. He only wants a glass of milk and 2 eggs. I'm glad I've never fallen to bad eggs." "Sleuth," echoed Bunting, staring at her. "What a queer name. How do you spell it? Sluth?" "No," she shot out. "Sleuth." "Oh," he said doubtfully. He said, "Think of a hound and you'll never forget my name," and Mrs. Bunting smiled. When he got to the door, Bunting turned round. "We'll now be able to pay young Chandler back some of that 30 shillings. I am glad." She nodded, her heart, as the saying is, too full for words. And then each went about his and her business, Bunting out into the drenching fog, his wife down to her cold kitchen. The lodger's tray was soon ready, everything upon it nicely and daintily arranged. Mrs. Bunting knew how to wait upon a gentleman. Just as the landlady was going up the kitchen stair, she suddenly remembered Mr. Sleuth's request for a Bible. Putting the tray down in the hall, she went into her sitting room and took up the book. But when back in the hall, she hesitated a moment as to whether it was worth while to make 2 journeys. But no, she thought she could manage. Clasping the large, heavy volume under her arm, and taking up the tray, she walked slowly up the staircase. But a great surprise awaited her. In fact, when Mr. Sleuth's landlady opened the door of the drawing-room, she very nearly dropped the tray. She actually did drop the Bible, and it fell with a heavy thud to the ground. The new lodger had turned all those nice framed engravings of the early Victorian beauties, of which Mrs. Bunting had been so proud, with their faces to the wall. For a moment she was really too surprised to speak. Putting the tray down on the table, she stooped and picked up the book. It troubled her that the book should have fallen to the ground, but really she hadn't been able to help it. It was mercy that the tray hadn't fallen too. Mr. Sleuth got up. I have taken the liberty to arrange the room as I should wish it to be," he said awkwardly. "You see, Mrs. Bunting, I felt as I sat here that these women's eyes followed me about. It was a most unpleasant sensation and gave me quite an eerie feeling." The landlady was now laying a small tablecloth over half of the table. She made no answer to her lodger's remark, for the good reason that she did not know what to say. Her silence seemed to distress Mr. Sleuth. After what seemed a long pause, he spoke again. "I prefer bare walls, Mrs. Bunting," he spoke with some agitation. "As a matter of fact, I have been used to seeing bare walls about me for a long time." And then, at last, his landlady answered him in a composed, soothing voice, which somehow did him good to hear. "I quite understand, sir. And when Bunting comes in, he shall take the pictures all down. We have plenty of space in our own rooms for them." Thank you very much." Mr. Sleuth appeared greatly relieved. "And I have brought you up my Bible, sir. I understand you wanted the loan of it." Mr. Sleuth stared at her as if dazed for a moment, and then rousing himself, he said, Yes, I do. There is no reading like the book. There is something there which suits every state of mind, aye, and of body too." "Very true, sir." And then Mrs. Bunting, having laid out what really looked a very appetizing little meal, turned round and quietly shut the door. She went down straight into her sitting room and waited there for Bunting instead of going to the kitchen to clear up. And as she did so, there came to her a comfortable recollection, an incident of her long past youth, in the days when she, then Ellen Green, had mated a dear old lady. The old lady had a favorite nephew, a bright, jolly young gentleman who was learning to paint animals in Paris. And one morning Mr. Algernon, that was his rather peculiar Christian name, had the impudence to turn to the wall 6 beautiful engravings of paintings done by the famous Mr. Landseer. Mrs. Bunting remembered all the circumstances as if they had only occurred yesterday, and yet she had not thought of them for years. It was quite early. She had come down, for in those days maids weren't thought so much of as they are now, and she slept with the upper housemaid, and it was the upper housemaid's duty to be down very early. And there, in the dining-room, she had found Mr. Algernon engaged in turning each engraving to the wall. Now his aunt thought all the world of those pictures, and Ellen had felt quite concerned, for it doesn't do for a young gentleman to put himself wrong with a kind aunt. "Oh, sir," she had exclaimed in dismay, "whatever are you doing?" And even now she could almost hear his merry voice as he had answered, "I am doing my duty, fair Helen." He had always called her fair Helen when no one was listening. "How can I draw ordinary animals when I see these half-human monsters staring at me all the time I am having my breakfast, my lunch, and my dinner?" That was what Mr. Algernon had said in his own saucy way, and that was what he repeated in a more serious, respectful manner to his aunt when that dear old lady had come downstairs. In fact, he had declared, quite soberly, that the beautiful animals painted by Mr. Landseer put his eye out. But his aunt had been very much annoyed. In fact, she had made him turn the pictures all back again, and as long as he stayed there, he just had to put up with what he called those half-human monsters. Mrs. Bunting, sitting there, thinking the matter of Mr. Sleuth's odd behavior over, was glad to recall that funny incident of her long-gone youth. It seemed to prove that her new lodger was not so strange as he appeared to be. Still, when Bunting came in, she did not tell him the queer thing which had happened. She told herself that she would be quite able to manage the taking down of the pictures in the drawing-room herself. But before getting ready their own supper, Mr. Sleuth's landlady went upstairs to clear away, and when on the staircase she heard the sound of, was it talking in the drawing-room? Startled, she waited a moment on the landing outside the drawing-room door. Then she realized that it was only the lodger reading aloud to himself. There was something very awful in the words which rose and fell on her listening ears. A strange woman is a narrow gate. She also lieth in wait as for a prey, and increaseth the transgressors among men. She remained where she was, her hand on the handle of the door, and again there broke on her shrinking ears that curious, high, sing-song voice. Her house is the way to hell, going down to the chambers of death. It made the listener feel quite queer, but at last she summoned up courage, knocked, and walked in. "I'd better clear away, sir, had I not?" she said, and Mr. Sleuth nodded. Then he got up and closed the book. "I think I'll go to bed now," he said. "I am very, very tired. I've had a long and a very weary day, Mrs. Bunting." After he had disappeared into the back room, Mrs. Bunting climbed up on a chair and unhooked the pictures which had so offended Mr. Sleuth. Each left an unsightly mark on the wall, but that, after all, could not be helped. Treading softly so that Bunting should not hear her, she carried them down 2 by 2 and stood them behind her bed. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Lodger by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 4. Mrs. Bunting woke up the next morning feeling happier than she had felt for a very, very long time. For just one moment she could not think why she felt so different, and then she suddenly remembered. How comfortable it was to know that upstairs, just over her head, lay, in the well-found bed she had bought with such satisfaction at an auction held in a Baker Street house, a lodger who was paying 2 guineas a week. Something seemed to tell her that Mr. Sleuth would be a permanency. In any case, it wouldn't be her fault if he wasn't. As to his queerness, well, there's always something funny in everybody. But after she had got up, and as the morning wore itself away, Mrs. Bunting grew a little anxious, for there came no sound at all from the new lodger's rooms. At 12, however, the drawing-room bell rang. Mrs. Bunting hurried upstairs. She was painfully anxious to please and satisfy Mr. Sleuth. His coming had only been in the nick of time to save them from terrible disaster. She found her lodger up and fully dressed. He was sitting at the round table which occupied the middle of the sitting-room, and his landlady's large Bible lay open before him. As Mrs. Bunting came in, he looked up, and she was troubled to see how tired and worn he seemed. "You did not happen," he asked, "to have a concordance, Mrs. Bunting?" She shook her head. She had no idea what a concordance could be, but she was quite sure that she had nothing of the sort about. And then her new lodger proceeded to tell her what it was he desired her to buy for him. She had supposed the bag he had brought with him to contain certain little necessaries of civilized life, such articles, for instance, as a comb and brush, a set of razors, a toothbrush, to say nothing of a couple of nightshirts. But no, that was evidently not so, for Mr. Sleuth required all these things to be bought now. After having cooked him a nice breakfast, Mrs. Bunting hurried out to purchase the things of which he was in urgent need. How pleasant it was to feel that there was money in her purse again. Not only someone else's money, but money she was now in the very act of earning so agreeably. Mrs. Bunting first made her way to a little barber's shop close by. It was there she purchased the brush and comb and the razors. It was a funny, rather smelly little place, and she hurried as much as she could, the more so that the foreigner who served her insisted on telling her some of the strange, peculiar details of this Avenger murder which had taken place 48 hours before, and in which Bunting took such a morbid interest. The conversation upset Mrs. Bunting. She didn't want to think of anything painful or disagreeable on such a day as this. Then she came back and showed the lodger her various purchases. Mr. Sleuth was pleased with everything and thanked her most courteously, but when she suggested doing his bedroom he frowned and looked quite put out. "Please wait till this evening," he said hastily. "It is my custom to stay at home all day. I only care to walk about the streets when the lights are lit. You must bear with me, Mrs. Bunting, if I seem a little, just a little unlike the lodgers you have been accustomed to, and I must ask you to understand that I must not be disturbed when thinking out my problems." He broke off short, sighed, then added solemnly, "For mine are the great problems of life and death." And Mrs. Bunting willingly fell in with his wishes. In spite of her prim manner and love of order, Mr. Sleuth's landlady was a true woman. She had, that is, an infinite patience with masculine vagaries and oddities. When she was downstairs again, Mr. Sleuth's landlady met with a surprise, but it was quite a pleasant surprise. While she had been upstairs talking to the lodger, Bunting's young friend, Joe Chandler, the detective, had come in, and as she walked into the sitting room, she saw that her husband was pushing half a sovereign across the table towards Joe. Joe Chandler's fair, good-natured face was full of satisfaction. Not at seeing his money again, mark you, but at the news Bunting had evidently been telling him, that news of the sudden wonderful change in their fortunes, the coming of an ideal lodger. "Mr. Sleuth don't want me to do his bedroom till he's gone out," she exclaimed, and then she sat down for a bit of a rest. It was a comfort to know that the lodger was eating his good breakfast, and there was no need to think of him for the present. In a few minutes she would be going down to make her own and Bunting's dinner, and she told Joe Chandler that he might as well stop and have a bite with them. Her heart warmed to the young man, for Mrs. Bunting was in a mood which seldom surprised her, a mood to be pleased with anything and everything. Nay, more. When Bunting began to ask Joe Chandler about the last of those awful Avenger murders, she even listened with a certain languid interest to all he had to say. In the morning paper which Bunting had begun taking again that very day, 3 columns were devoted to the extraordinary mystery, which was now beginning to be the one topic of talk all over London, west and east, north and south. Bunting had read out little bits about it while they ate their breakfast, and in spite of herself, Mrs. Bunting had felt thrilled and excited. "They do say," observed Bunting cautiously, "they do say, Joe, that the police have a clue they won't say nothing about." He looked expectantly at his visitor. To Bunting, the fact that Chandler was attached to the detective section of the Metropolitan Police invested the young man with a kind of sinister glory, especially just now, when these awful and mysterious crimes were amazing and terrifying the town. "Them who says that says wrong," answered Chandler slowly, and a look of unease, of resentment came over his fair, stolid face. "'Twould make a good bit of difference to me if the Yard had a clue." And then Mrs. Bunting interposed. "Why that, Joe?" she said, smiling indulgently. The young man's keenness about his work pleased her, and in his slow, sure way Joe Chandler was very keen and took his job very seriously. He put his whole heart and mind into it. "Well, 'tis this way," he explained. "From today I'm on this business myself. You see, Mrs. Bunting, the Yard's nettled. That's what it is, and we're all on our mettle. That we are. I was right down sorry for the poor chap who was on point duty in the street where the last one happened." "No," said Bunting incredulously. "You don't mean there was a policeman there within a few yards?" That fact hadn't been recorded in his newspaper. Chandler nodded. "That's exactly what I do mean, Mr. Bunting. The man is near off his head, so I'm told. He did hear a yell, so he says, but he took no notice. There are a few good yells in that part of London, as you can guess. People always quarreling and rowing at one another in such low parts." "Have you seen the bits of grey paper on which the monster writes his name?" inquired Bunting eagerly. Public imagination had been much stirred by the account of those 3-cornered pieces of grey paper, pinned to the victim's skirts, on which was roughly written in red ink and in printed characters the words, "The Avenger." His round, fat face was full of questioning eagerness. He put his elbows on the table and stared across expectantly at the young man. "Yes, I have," said Joe briefly. "A funny kind of visiting card, eh?" Bunting laughed. The notion struck him as downright comic. But Mrs. Bunting colored. "It isn't a thing to make a joke about," she said reprovingly. And Chandler backed her up. "No, indeed," he said feelingly. "I'll never forget what I've been made to see over this job. And as for that gray bit of paper, Mr. Bunting, or rather those gray bits of paper," he corrected himself hastily. "You know they've 3 of them now at the yard. Well, they gives me the horrors." And then he jumped up. "That reminds me that I oughtn't to be wasting my time in pleasant company. Won't you stay and have a bit of dinner?" said Mrs. Bunting solicitously. But the detective shook his head. "No," he said, "I had a bite before I came out. Our job's a queer kind of job, as you know. A lot's left to our discretion, so to speak, but it don't leave us much time for lazing about, I can tell you." When he reached the door, he turned round, and with elaborate carelessness he inquired, "Any chance of Miss Daisy coming to London again soon?" Bunting shook his head, but his face brightened. He was very, very fond of his only child. The pity was he saw her so seldom. "No," he said, "I'm afraid not, Joe. Old Aunt, as we calls the old lady, keeps Daisy pretty tightly tied to her apron string. She was quite put about that week the child was up with us last June." "Indeed? Well, so long." After his wife had let their friend out, Bunting said cheerfully, "Joe seems to like our Daisy, eh, Ellen?" But Mrs. Bunting shook her head scornfully. She did not exactly dislike the girl, though she did not hold with the way Bunting's daughter was being managed by that old aunt of hers, an idle, good-for-nothing way, very different from the fashion in which she herself had been trained at the Foundling, for Mrs. Bunting as a little child had known no other home, no other family than those provided by good Captain Coram. "Joe Chandler's too sensible a young chap to be thinking of girls yet awhile," she said tartly. "No doubt you're right," Bunting agreed. "Times be changed. In my young days, chaps always had time for that. 'Twas just a notion that came into my head, hearing him asking, anxious-like, after her." About 5 o'clock, after the street lamps were well alight, Mr. Sleuth went out, and that same evening there came 2 parcels addressed to his landlady. These parcels contained clothes, but it was quite clear to Mrs. Bunting's eyes that they were not new clothes. In fact, they had evidently been bought in some good second-hand clothes shop. A funny thing for a real gentleman like Mr. Sleuth to do. It proved that he had given up all hope of getting back his lost luggage. When the lodger had gone out, he had not taken his bag with him. Of that Mrs. Bunting was positive. And yet, though she searched high and low for it, she could not find the place where Mr. Sleuth kept it, and at last, had it not been that she was a very clear-headed woman with a good memory, she would have been disposed to think that the bag had never existed, save in her imagination. But no, she could not tell herself that. She remembered exactly how it had looked when Mr. Sleuth had first stood, a strange, queer-looking figure of a man, on her doorstep. She further remembered how he had put the bag down on the floor of the top front room, and then, forgetting what he had done, how he had asked her eagerly, in a tone of angry fear, where the bag was, only to find it safely lodged at his feet. As time went on, Mrs. Bunting thought a great deal about that bag. For a strange and amazing fact, she never saw Mr. Sleuth's bag again. But of course she soon formed a theory as to its whereabouts. The brown leather bag which had formed Mr. Sleuth's only luggage the afternoon of his arrival was almost certainly locked up in the lower part of the drawing-room chiffonier. Mr. Sleuth evidently always carried the key of a little corner cupboard about his person. Mrs. Bunting had also had a good hunt for that key, but, as was the case with the bag, the key disappeared, and she never saw either the one or the other again. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Leanne Howlett.